Oh yeah, the fight is on. Everyone loves a good fight. You know, the modern evangelism movement could be credited to John Wesley and George Whitefield. John Wesley was one of the first men to term the new birth. Sounds familiar, huh? Well, he started the Holy Club with his brother and other men. Among them was George Whitefield. They eventually had a falling out, and I'm talking about George Whitefield and John Wesley, of course, but I believe God used these men to affect the culture and mold what is America today. They created a pattern of ministry in the Western world because of certain events that were occurring around them as America was changing into the nation that it is today. John Wesley was a highly educated minister, legally ordained by the Anglican Church, who eventually had to set sail for the New World. On the way to America, he found the lack of personal relationship he needed in his life with Christ. It's this kind of strife that really makes me admire the man very much. The way that he wanted to be a better person, that really is amazing to me. And I have to respect him for that. We get a personal love of Christ from his time with the MOravians, who also counseled with him, and you get the highly educated pastor as well with John Wesley. If these accounts did not happen, maybe there would not be Methodists today. John Wesley and friends were called Methodists because of the strong moral codes they imposed on themselves. You know, kind of like the Lone Ranger did. He had a code of conduct to live by. John Wesley believed that man could determine his own fate, whether he could face heaven or hell. It is a strong belief that I think would be an example of change in the modern evangelical movement. The passion he learned from MOravians would motivate him to see that others are saved from hell. It's this kind of passion that put him in disgust of the treatment of slaves in then America, and so much that he preached against slavery and wanted to end it so much. These are some of the differences that Whitefield and Wesley maintained. Wesley had so much passion in his heart that it put him in a position to rebel against the Anglican Church, which meant going against the king. Wesley had spread God's message so much that he could not make trips that were needed, so he had to ordain ministers to help with Lord's work. The strive for perfection and passion and education of John Wesley is amazing. He is a great example to live by. The Baptists, the Charismatics, and many others today hold him in high esteem, as well they should. George Whitefield, on the other hand, still had an important part of changing and molding the modern evangelical movement. John and George were both open-air preachers. They did not care much for the pulpit experience, as did the many Anglican clerics did, who loved to be exalted above men. These guys loved the common man. They would preach to anyone. George had an interesting history. He was raised to be an actor in England. He loved the theater, and it might explain the thousands he preached to. Benjamin Franklin loved to go to his meetings. George, however, was a Calvinist, and he believed that man had no say in his destiny. This was confusion to me until I looked into his life, and I looked at the time. I am trying to say, if George Whitefield was such a believer in predestination, why would he evangelize? If a man believes that he's not the determining factor of his own fate, why would he go to thousands and preach the gospel? At the same time, Charles Wesley wrote hymns, and now a hymn was written at the time where the ministers would sing the stanza and then the people would repeat it. The reason for this was because hymnals were expensive. Now think about this. In early America, would it not come to reason that if hymnals were expensive, weren't Bibles also expensive as well? God used Whitefield not as an evangelist, but as someone who could tell the Bible to common man. George liked performance, that he loved to tell the Bible in an interesting fashion. The years of learning the theater was put to good use in George Whitefield's messages. God used George to get the Bible across the nation through him in a time when Bibles were scarce. I previously mentioned that Whitefield was a slavery supporter, but was intolerant for the abuse of slavery. Benjamin Franklin, who opposed slavery, loved George Whitefield, and probably would not like him if George did not take a stand against the abuse and the horrible treatment of slaves, which helped fuel the fire of the abolitionists at the time. Some slave owners even developed moral codes like John Wesley did, a methodical way of living his holy life. One of these who had a code that he taught was Robert E. Lee. And I wonder if Robert E. Lee would have had his own thoughts about the code of slavery if it was not for George Whitefield. Now, slavery is bad, but the abuse of slavery here in the early colonial America was not that bad as the heavily Catholic nations of the Spaniards who had no respect for the natives or the slaves. The question is, did George Whitefield lighten the abuse of slavery in America? You know, kind of like a 20-week abortion ban is the lighter load on the babies in the mother's womb. The truth is, if we want an end to the murder of innocent, but we will take this one day alive saved bill until we get full protection of the innocent. As you can see, God used these men to help create one of the greatest nations in the world. One to help spread the Bible through word, and one to help give us an example to live by. Whether you agree with the Arminian Wesley or the Calvinist Whitefield, God used these men, and God can use anyone. I think Whitefield said it best in one of his sermons. He said this: I suppose the potter, without the least imputation of injustice, might have thrown it aside, the clay, and taken up another piece of clay in its room. But he did not. He made it again another vessel. And does the potter call counsel in his domestics to inquire of them of what kind of vessel they would advise him to make of it? No, in no wise. He made again another vessel, as seemed good to the potter to make it. The vessel being us, and the potter being God, can use anyone, even a fluffy, grouchy squirrel. So think about it, won't ya? And have a beautiful day.
Watch out for money, love. He'll entice your soul. Mister, hold the world. Will promise you silver and gold. Jesus says to you, I do not love this passing world of things that soon will die. Serve him as your king and set your mind on things on high. The Pilgrim's Progress, not an easy way. It's a journey to the sun, day by day. Following Jesus is a walk of grace. Don't be casual Christian.